So, Lord of the Flies. I think The Simpsons kind of summed it up best.
Oh, no food, no shelter, no monkey butlers. This island is a death hole.
So, weird little story about reading Lord of the Flies. I started reading the book because I hadn't read it ever. This is my first time ever reading it. I just finished it this past week, and I have mixed feelings about it, which I'll get into. But so the funny little story is that I started reading it. I thought, hey, it'll be a quick read. It's like 200 pages, and I got about 30 pages into it, and I was bored. And so I stopped, and I was like, okay, well, I guess I need something else to read at the same time as this. I thought, reading this short little novel would be a breeze, but it was turning out to be a slog. So I decided I'd grab something else to kind of cleanse my palate as I read it. So I started reading Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King, and I swear I got about 30 pages into that book, and it mentions Lord of the Flies, and it starts talking about it and the things that happen in it. I'm like, well, great. Now I have to go back and actually read this book. So I stopped Hearts in Atlantis. I went back to this book, and I slogged through it so that now I can read Hearts in Atlantis and not be like, what are they talking about? All that being said, I was not privileged enough when I was young to have read a lot of the classics in school. Little rant here for you that I always wanted to be reading Lord of the Flies, Fahrenheit 451, 1984, Brave New World, Once and Future King, Alice in Wonderland. Like, you name a lot of these classics. That's what I wanted to be reading in school. And unfortunately, I didn't really read pretty much any of those until my senior year in high school. Where a lot of my friends in junior high and high school were reading Lord of the Flies, lots of Shakespeare, all of these other classic novels. I got stuck reading things, especially in high school, that I should have read in fifth grade. Or it was a fifth grade reading level. It was like one of the, not even a fifth grade reading level, but it was just, I won't name the books because I'm not going to try and shame or anything like that, but I wasn't reading all of these other books that everybody kept talking about. So if I was going to read them, I had to read them on my own. And that was a little hard because I wanted to read fantasy, and that was my big thing when I was younger, and it still is. I still love fantasy. It's probably my favorite genre. But that's what I wanted to be reading, and I didn't want to have to read these classic books. But I thought that, school will make me read them. So it's kind of like an excuse, right? It's like I get to read the classics because they're making me read the classics. And then the rest of it I can just pretend like I'm doing it on my own for fun. Weird mental gymnastics, but that's what I thought. Didn't happen. I think I finally started reading some of these classics when I was in junior in high school and senior in high school. And that's when I finally read Scarlet Letter, which I hated, Fahrenheit 451, which I loved. And then my senior year, we were given a sheet, basically, of 100 classic books. It's like choose 2 of them per semester. I graduated a semester early, so I only got to read, or had to read, 2. So I read 1984 and Brave New World, where most of my classmates chose Metamorphosis because it was supposed to be like super short. And turns out I read 1984 faster than they read Metamorphosis. Anyway, so I was not privileged or graced with being able to read Lord of the Flies in school. And so we didn't do a whole section on it. We didn't do questions and answers and tests and all those kinds of things on it. So there was no analysis of it in my life. There's just me now having read it, having seen references to it in pop culture, Simpsons obviously, as well as others. And now here I am. I've read it myself and feel kind of disappointed. It was a good, let me first say, good book. Deserves to be a classic. Think everybody should read it probably before high school, or at the very least their freshman year. But that doesn't mean I wasn't bored. I was bored, like really bored with most of this book. It started out kind of interesting, and spoiler alert for anybody, but I mean, it is one of those classic books, and probably most everybody knows what it's about and everything. But essentially, boys get stranded on an island. I think it was a plane crash. It didn't officially say, I don't think. Some people said it was a shipwreck. Sounded to me like a plane crash, because everybody was like scattered about the island. I could be wrong, but I don't think it really matters. So boys find themselves on an island. They're adolescent, no adults. And at first they just think, hey, this is cool, this is an adventure. And then very quickly realize, well, now we have to fend for ourselves. What are we going to do? The only one who seems to care is a character they call Piggy. And some of the things that these kids do aren't realistic. Now, I know that this is like a metaphor, a fable, an allegory, blah, 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 whatever term you want to use. It's essentially a teaching story, kind of like Animal Farm, books like that, which I liked Animal Farm, but even then a lot of it was lost on me. So that's another story. But so the kids find themselves on an island. I just didn't feel like some of these things were realistic. They weren't realistic reactions. At first, essentially the main character, Ralph, seemed like a sociopath. He didn't seem to have any emotion whatsoever about anything that was going on. Didn't care, just wanted to have fun. Piggy, more realistic character, very intellectual. And I realize they're all supposed to kind of represent portions of society and things like that. And also I think it's supposed to be a scathing review of the British school system at the time. And this book is well over or about 60 years old or so. So lots of things have changed. So even then, and especially things have changed since I was young, this might have had more impact on me had I read it when I was more closer to these kids' age instead of in my 30s. Hopefully you don't think I look like I'm in my 30s, but yeah. But yeah, the characters just didn't feel like they were making conscious, good decisions. Now, granted, they're kids and they're stranded on an island, and nobody really prepares you for that unless you're in the Boy Scouts, and even then they probably don't. So you have a character named Piggy, and his first thing to say is, well, I have this nickname, but I don't like people calling it, but I'll tell you what the nickname is. Why would you do that? If you don't like somebody calling you something, why would you even tell them what it is so that they could even use it? Because guess what? You are 12-year-old boys, 12, 11, and even younger. And it's like, well, duh, they're going to use that nickname. So here we're stuck with a kid named Piggy in this whole book. And Ralph, essentially the four main characters are Ralph, Piggy, Simon, and Jack. And at first things are great. They get the conch, and it's like the totem that they have that they call upon, they use to call people to meetings and whatnot, and they start thinking, okay, we'll climb up this mountain, we'll light a fire, we'll get rescued really quickly, everything will be great. And then some time goes by, and they're lazy. These kids are lazy, and they're young boys. Duh, they're gonna get lazy and bored, and they just want to play and have fun, and they don't realize the seriousness of the situation. I think it slowly starts sinking into Ralph that there's a seriousness of the situation. Piggy has always been scared of the whole thing, and it's just this mishmash of all these things going on. And at first I thought this was going to be a clip in a long book, right? It's 200 pages. But it was just so boring. And I was about halfway through it when I realized this book should be it should be half as long. It should only be this long. It should essentially be like a really short story. And because the author, and this is all me, right? My opinion, was trying to wax poetic. He was trying to have purple prose, and he was just making it ugly. He kept trying to be what he shouldn't be and saying what he shouldn't. He should have kept it very distilled, and it wasn't. It meandered a lot. It's the same argument I hear a lot for Lord of the Rings, especially Fellowship of the Rings, where he talks about every tree and plant and just really describes all of the forests and nature and the rivers and everything like that, and very little about what's going on with the characters. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what William Golding is doing in this. He's trying to write these really purple prose, these really pretty descriptions of the island, which at first would come in handy, right? When the kids first show up on the island and they're just entranced by it, and it just seems like an oasis, maybe like, oh, this is really cool, which would make sense. But as it goes on, those descriptions should disappear, because it's not about the island anymore. It's about the kids. It's about their interactions with each other and their descent into savagery from what they had supposed was civility. But it meandered on and on about all the branches and the trees and the flowers and the mountains and the rocks and the beach and everything. And I'm just like, I don't. And the worst part is, it would have been fine, I guess, had the descriptions made sense. Now, there is a point also that I will acknowledge, that this is, again, around 60 years old. It's also an English author, I believe, and written with English boys and with a British English. And I'm American, and I speak American English. So there's a barrier right there. There's also a slight cultural barrier, obviously, of Britain and England and all of that, and how they do schooling and how they talk and the things that they say. So there was some of that in here that I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying. Where a British person would probably be like, I know exactly what they're saying. I'm sure there's the same situation vice versa, right? When American books go over to Britain and they're like, what in the world does that mean? You know, whatever expressions we have, which if anybody from England ever ends up watching this, totally let me know if you've ever come across that in the comments of English books and slang terms and whatever. Anyway, so there's those barriers, right? There's the British English, just the culture itself, and time. So there's some barriers right there to have to get over, and to have to, I guess, acknowledge whenever you read older books and say, okay, this is from a different time, this is from a different place. They have different language in some instances, so I have to keep that in mind when I'm reading this, and try not to hold that against it, because that would be unfair. It would be very unfair for an English person to criticize my book because they're English, I'm American, and they just don't understand it. And if there was like decades and decades of time difference, right? So trying to be fair in that is, but just my opinion, I'm saying his descriptions were bad. His descriptions meandered and didn't make any sense most of the time. And I was like, I'm lost. You've sucked me out of this story that's supposed to be about these children who are stranded on an island and go from somewhat civilized young boys to complete and utter what we would term savagery, right? And so he lost me. And even more so as I read through it, and it was a slog. I thought this would take me maybe a week to read if I was reading it slowly. It took me like 2.5 weeks. It was just so slow, and it was so hard to get through. For 200 pages, right? Like, I've read 200-page books pretty quickly sometimes, especially if I really get into it. And that doesn't mean it's a bad book. It is a good book, and I still think people should read it. And I also felt at the end it didn't fulfill what it could have. Now, I say that, And I think of, because I just watched it, the Simpsons, again, the Simpsons episode.
So the children learned to function as a society, and eventually they were rescued by, let's say, Moe.
That ending was about how I felt, kind of like, with this book. It felt like, oh, the people showed up. And I knew they were going to get rescued. I just didn't know exactly who was going to get rescued necessarily and how. But that's all it felt like is, oh, somebody showed up. Oh, we're crying. We've lost our innocence. We're done. Again, spoiler alert, I guess, if anybody's interested. But I think you all knew. I think most everybody knew. How I wanted it to end, I was really, really hoping, as it did pick up there at the end, the last few pages, where everybody has descended into savagery. 2 kids have been killed, and Ralph, the main character, is being chased by all the rest of the kids, and they're going to kill him. They're going to kill him and sacrifice him to this beast that they think lives on the island, and they've just descended completely into madness, into savagery, and he's the only one who has even a little bit of civility left. So he's running away from them. They're chasing after him, and I was like, okay, here's what I want to happen. I want him to get rescued. Obviously, he's going to get rescued. I knew how it was going to end. What I wanted to happen was him to run out on the beach after the kids have been chasing him in the forest, and there's a boat. Oh, somebody's there to rescue him. So they rescue him, and probably they say something along the lines of, is there anybody else here on the island? And his reply would be, nobody like me. Nobody civilized anymore. Just saying the truth, but not the full truth. And then, gets in the boat. They're going back out to the big ship, because obviously it would be a little dingy. And that's when all of the kids run onto the beach, but they're all painted, right? They're all painted in their faces and whooping and hollering and have spears. They'll look like natives, like cannibal natives. And that's when, the captain of the ship with Ralph would be like, how did you survive on an island full of savages? And I wanted Ralph to probably reply, again, something along the lines of, I don't know that I did survive. And that's when he cries, because he's lost his innocence. That's when on the island they start to cry and wail and fall to their knees, because they realize in their sacrifice of their civility, they're now stranded and they're dead. Because essentially Ralph has left them for dead. Where they were going to kill him, he's now killed them. Where they abandoned him because he was originally the chief, now he's abandoned them. I wanted it to be this full 180 turn that happens, and it to be just raw and horrible, because that's what these kids, they all abandoned their humanity, if you will, and just descended into this horrible kind of state. But instead it's just, they all wind up on the beach, and it's so sad. Which was still effective, but I feel like it could have been harder. I wanted the author to nail it home, to be like, boom, they've all lost their civility. You could argue, well, Ralph still had his, he still had his humanity, because he wasn't willing to do that. He wanted them to survive. He wanted them to be rescued. But I didn't want any of them to have their humanity left. I wanted to see the complexities of all those people abandoned their humanity, and he still retained his, but I wanted him to abandon his humanity in a different way, saying he could have saved them, even though he could have had mercy, essentially, and helped save those people, even though they had turned on him and were trying to kill him. Instead, he chose selfishness. He chose himself, and he left. He left without them. That's what I wanted to see, because it's supposed to be this big old metaphor or whatever for actual life, because it's this tale of these kids that have descended into this savagery when the world is at war around them, whatever war it may be. It never really exactly says, and it's not really important as which war it is. It's just like there's a war going on, and it's saying, you know, just because you dress it up with fancy ships, you dress it up with fancy titles and civility and some rules, doesn't mean it's not savagery. And there's different ways to be savage. Obviously, killing your enemies ruthlessly is one, but also abandoning them is another. And there's been plenty of wars where we've had a battle and then we just left. And we left the people to pick up the pieces or to die. And that's what I kind of wanted Ralph to reflect, is I'm leaving. You can pick up the pieces and somehow survive or die. And obviously the island would probably, full of boys, would descend into complete chaos, and they would all die because eventually they'd run out of food and they'd all get sick and whatever. So he would essentially be condemning the death, but he just wouldn't care, or maybe he would delude himself into thinking, they'll be fine. You know, this is the life they've chosen. So he could have gone further in the book, and maybe if I had done this in school, we could have discussed some of those things and maybe discussed more of what the author intended, thought, some of his things about it. When I do these reviews, I'm not doing really any research or anything like that on this. I'm just reading it. I'm reading it, and then I'm coming and talking to you guys about it. So those are my basic thoughts about Lord of the Flies. Good book. Everybody should read it. Hopefully, most of you, if not all of you, have read it, and have read it when you were like in junior high school, and not when you're in middle age and studying at home, unless it's one of those books that you read all the time. That's great too. But I think it's definitely a must read, and I'm glad I read it, even though it was kind of a slog and it was kind of boring. But just because it's boring doesn't mean it's bad. Anyway, thank you for watching again. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Again, check out my links below for my Twitter, Instagram, my website. Check out the book I've written, A Clash of Symphonies. It's available on Kindle, currently Kindle Unlimited. You can get it in print and digital, and you can also get it in audiobook on audible.com. Next time, I don't know what I'm talking about because I kind of do this at random, so hopefully you'll tune in again. Anyways, thanks for watching. God bless, and stay safe. Bye.